Don't you dare touch me! Stand back!
The story is about a man named Jackie Chan, whose family was so poor they barely had anything to eat. He survived by doing calligraphy on the streets, but during tough economic times, he lost even that job. With no rice left to cook, his wife urged him to come up with a solution, but he couldn't think of anything. His wife then told him to either steal or rob someone, saying it was better than sitting at home waiting to starve to death. But Jackie Chan, being lazy, kept making excuses that he wasn't capable of doing anything. His wife, furious, exclaimed that if he continued to be useless, she would have to sell herself to earn money to feed a lazy man like him. This led to a fierce argument between the couple that lasted the whole evening. That night, Jackie Chan couldn't sleep. Hungry and thinking about his wife's scolding, he went outside for some fresh air, feeling both annoyed and ashamed. He thought to himself, "Am I really so worthless that I'd let my wife sell herself to save me? If that's the case, I'd rather die." With that thought, he tied his belt to a tree and prepared to end his life. Just as he slipped the noose around his neck, he suddenly saw the apparition of his late father. "You useless fool, you're strong and healthy, yet you lie around doing nothing. And now you think hanging yourself is the answer? Even if you have to steal or rob, bring home money to support your wife. Fine, let me give you a tip. In the neighboring village, there's a monster wreaking havoc. Go there, wait, and you'll find money. Trust me." After saying this, his father's apparition disappeared and the belt snapped, sending Jackie Chan tumbling to the ground in pain. Back in his room, Jackie Chan thought about what had just happened. Could this be a sign from his father? No, tomorrow I'll become a thief. Let's see who dares to look down on me after that. Determined, he decided to try his father's advice and check out the neighboring village for opportunities. Early the next morning, Jackie Chan headed for the neighboring village. His wife tried to stop him but couldn't. When he arrived, he saw a notice posted on the wall of a large house and went closer to read it. The notice stated that the Kim family had been troubled by a monster recently. Anyone who could eliminate the monster would be rewarded with 100 silver taels. The story went that a few nights ago, the young lady of the Kim family was asleep when a strange man climbed into her room. The man was hideous, but had an unnaturally long tongue. He looked at the young lady with a greedy expression. The young lady tried to scream for help, but the man immediately thrust his long tongue into her mouth. She became paralyzed, unable to make more than a faint whimper before falling unconscious. The next morning, the maid and the wet nurse found the young lady naked and violated. She only woke up when they entered the room. After recounting the incident, the young lady urged them to keep the matter quiet to protect her reputation. She also revealed that the strange man had promised to return that night. That evening, the maids and wet nurse armed themselves with sticks and stood guard both inside and outside her room, waiting for the long-tongued monster to appear. Sure enough, the strange man returned that night, walking in confidently as if no one could stop him. In the blink of an eye, he opened his mouth and exhaled a murky gas. The maids who approached him immediately fainted. The man then carried two of them into the young lady's room. Inside, he was surprised to find the young lady, the maids, and even the wet nurse already unconscious on the bed. Had his gas been so effective that it reached inside without him realizing it? By the next morning, the two maids who had been guarding the door were missing, Everyone else in the room had been violated, including the wet nurse. Only then did they report the incident to the Kim family patriarch, who was furious. If word of this spread, the Kim family's reputation would be ruined. So, the patriarch posted a notice calling for skilled individuals to eliminate the monster. Jackie Chan thought to himself that the Kim patriarch must have prepared the reward money. Instead of fighting the monster, he decided to sneak into the estate that night to steal the silver. That night, recalling his father's advice, Jackie Chan armed himself with a wooden stick and hid in the fields near the Kim estate, planning to steal the reward money amidst the chaos caused by the monster. Following his father's instructions, he waited patiently until it was late and quiet. However, he dozed off without realizing it. He was eventually awakened by strange noises. Peeking out, he saw a strange man with an odd figure heading toward the Kim estate's wall. Jackie Chan thought, "Damn it, someone's beat me to it. All I did was nap for a bit." Noticing the bundle on the man's back, Jackie Chan assumed it was filled with stolen money. Seeing the man about to leave, he thought, "I should knock him out and take the money for myself." With that, he sneaked closer. Raising his wooden stick, he struck the man hard. Fearing retaliation, he delivered a second blow while the man was down. Summoning all his courage, he kept striking, his intention now shifting from robbery to murder. His eyes gleamed with malice. "If society won't let me live honestly, I'll become a thief," he thought, beating the figure relentlessly. But when he finally stopped and looked, it wasn't a man lying on the ground. It was a massive soft-shell turtle he had beaten to death. Jackie Chan immediately called the Kim patriarch to show off his heroic deed. To his surprise, his attempted theft turned him into a monster-slaying hero. The Kim patriarch ordered the giant turtle to be cooked as a nourishing soup and rewarded Jackie Chan with silver. From then on, the Kim family was free of disturbances, and Jackie Chan returned home with money, beginning a better life with his wife.
Until now, this story has spread widely in my village. It was summer and the weather was burning hot. To get some fresh air, some men huddled together and sat in front of the alley. At night, mosquitoes became more active. They were everywhere and bit them, so they became irritated and scowled. When everyone noticed that the sky was getting darker, they all decided to go home early. The old men banded together, and they didn't forget to tell Uncle Pew to hurry back home because they heard rumors of ghosts appearing in this area recently. Uncle Pew could only laugh after hearing them grumble and heading home one by one. Because he didn't intend to go home at this time anyways, so he hummed to let everyone go first. Talk about Uncle Pew. He came to this village many years ago to live with his family and work as a teacher, but he was unlucky because his wife died young, leaving only him and his children. They grew up and moved to the city to pursue their careers, leaving him alone in this village. Coming home in this hot weather was very uncomfortable for such a lonely person, so it was better to sit outside and enjoy the air, thinking, and then Uncle Pew kept smoking. Because it was full moon day, the moon was especially big and bright, accompanied by the quiet atmosphere of the poor countryside, which really made people feel more lonely and cold. Uncle Pew was still sitting there, unsure what to think. The cigarette butts were all over his feet, and he had no idea how long he had been sitting there. But Uncle Pew didn't care. He continued to smoke and think about life without returning home, and as a result, he witnessed something horrifying. Uncle Pew took out the last cigarette from the box, thinking that when he finished it, he would return home, so he slowly took it out, then lighted it up, took a long breath. The light from the lighter was most likely the only glimmer at this point. The sound of footsteps from afar suddenly sounded in that quiet space, catching Uncle Pew's attention. Because it was too late at this time, there was no one left to walk down the street. The entire street was most likely just him who hadn't returned home. Uncle Pew looked up, curious to see who it was. The silhouettes of two people slowly approached from the darkness, looking at the tall figures that were most probably men, even though he couldn't see them clearly, but still could figure that they looked very unusual. The two men did not walk up to Uncle Pew, but rather around a nearby stone mill. Uncle Pew had no idea what they were up to or what they were saying. Only glimpses of their figures could be seen. They just kept going around the mill. Uncle Pew slowly stood up and approached them, asking what they were doing and if he could help them in any way as a diversion, because he didn't want to go home alone anyway. Uncle Pew approached and inquired, but received no response from the other two, who were still walking around the mill, unsure what to do. It appeared to be two tall figures, but why were they always lowering their heads like that? Perhaps they were looking for something on the ground, so Uncle Pew directly stated that he had a flashlight, which could assist them in finding it more easily. At this point, they began to respond to Uncle Pew, but their voices were shaky and made the hairs on their back of the listener's neck shiver, as if they were speaking from the underworld rather than living people. But that wasn't what bothered Uncle Pew. It was the fact that they claimed to be looking for their heads. Uncle Pew was stunned and motionless as a result of the response. Then, in the dim moonlight, Uncle Pew noticed an anomaly from the other two, who were clearly speaking to him, but he couldn't see their heads. It was impossible to talk while bowing at the same time. When Uncle Pew noticed that things were getting stranger, he decided to turn on his flashlight and shined it on them to see who they were, because there was no one in this village he didn't know. He asked their names, shining at them at the same time. Uncle Pew directly shone on their faces as the light began to shine from below. They still did not respond. As the flashlight slowly shone on the body, a terrible thing appeared in front of Uncle Pew's eyes, making him panic. Not that they had their heads down, but they had no heads at all. Uncle Pew's heart was pounding and sweating as he realized he had met devils and that everything in front of him was too frightening. At the same time, the other two demons kept asking Uncle Pew if he had seen their heads. They searched for a long time but couldn't find them. Their shapes were gradually becoming stranger and stranger. That increased his panic and fear, and Uncle Pew fell backwards, but his legs were frozen without realizing it, causing him to fall backwards and drop the cigarettes in his mouth. The surrounding space seemed to come to a halt. It gradually darkened and the other two demons moved towards Uncle Pew. Nothing but the voices of the other two demons could be heard at this time. They got closer. The sound became more piercing. Uncle Pew looked at them in terror. Even more terrifying, their silhouettes became increasingly distorted, making them appear monstrous. Suddenly, he felt his head spinning, and the pain was so intense that it appeared as if someone was hitting it with a hammer. Uncle Pew began to feel suffocated, which was accompanied by an unfathomable stench that hit his nose. Then the surrounding atmosphere went black, and Uncle Pew passed out. Hallucinations began to appear in his mind. The stone mill kept appearing in his mind. Next, A clear scene began to appear more clearly, and Uncle Pew saw many people standing around the stone mill. They dressed like the old-style Japanese army, and they still had guns and swords in their hands. They looked threatening. Then there was an image of two men with their hands tied and kneeling on the ground, while the other soldiers waved their swords ready to cut off their heads. A man with a violent appearance, who appeared to be the commander, raised his hand to issue orders to those soldiers. The sharp sword was raised to its full height and slashed down hard. Blood splattered everywhere, even on the soldiers' faces, but on their lips were merciless smiles. The sharp sword severed the two heads, which fell to the ground and stared at Uncle Pew. The two heads were lying on the ground, and their bodies were hung in front of the village gate by the soldiers. The villagers were so terrified that they didn't dare to bring the two heads to bury. Seeing these things made Uncle Pew panic and startle awake. Everything was so real that Uncle Pew felt as if he had just witnessed the execution at that time. But as soon as he opened his eyes, he realized he was still in the village, and the two headless young men from earlier were also approaching him. He screamed and fainted again in terror. Not sure how long he had been lying there, but he faintly heard a voice calling him in his ear, but didn't dare to open his eyes. Despite the villagers' attempt to wake him up and ask him why he was lying here, Uncle Pew refused to open his eyes. It was only until he had calmed down a little and the sunlight was shining in his eyes that he dared to slowly open his eyes and see two people from the village looking at him with suspicion. Uncle Pew stood up. He heard that when people started to go to work early in the morning, they saw him lying on the ground and came to wake him up. Many people gathered because they thought Uncle Pew had seen a ghost last night. Uncle Pew had no idea he'd been lying out there all night, nor did he know when he fainted. He began to tell everyone everything. Uncle Pew also described their appearance and costumes and confirmed that the two ghosts were looking for their heads in this area. When an old man who had lived in the village for a long time heard that and recalled the past, there were two young men from the village that were executed at this very mill, but their heads were stolen by wild animals and their bodies were buried by the villagers. People could observe two headless strangers prowling around on the full moon nights after that time. They always asked where their heads were each time they met any villagers. The voices would sound as if it had came straight from hell. The story took place in a small village in Hunan province, China. In the village, Zhao and Li were a young couple who grew up together and had a very good relationship, but their parents didn't approve of their relationship. The two young people didn't want to be separated, but no matter how hard they tried to persuade their families, the parents on both sides disagreed, and the two were forced to separate. Without much thought, their fingers interlocked, and the decision was made. There would be no more laughter, no more tears, only deep love from their hearts, and not even death would be able to separate them. Without a second of hesitation, they did what they decided. They stepped into the deep water while holding hands, allowing the river to drown them. Just as the two were about to sink into the water, an elderly man named Lu, who was hoeing nearby, noticed that something was wrong. Lu was terrified and dashed into the river to save them. The old man tried his best, but now the two of them were submerged. He fumbled in the river for a while before rescuing Xiao. Because he was too old, it took him a lot of effort to pull Xiao ashore. Now, when he looked back, he wanted to go into the water to save Lee, but there was no sign of her in the river, as she had drifted with the current. Fortunately, Xiao choked on the water in his mouth and gradually awoke, but when he awoke he saw that he was the only one saved. Lee had vanished, and he ran into the river, desperately crying and wanted to be with Lee. But the old man held him tight. Xiao cried bitterly as he looked at the rising river, saying clearly that they wanted to be together by choosing death, so why did they still have to be apart? At this point, Lu could only console Xiao with words before escorting him back home. After returning home, Xiao rushed to Li's house to inform the family of the news, and Li's parents and brother immediately ran to the river. Many people in the village came after hearing the news and gathered on the river bank.
Li, my daughter!
Her mother cried. Li's father asked many people to assist him in getting into the river to retrieve the body, while her mother was kneeling on the ground and crying so hard that her heart was tearing. But after searching the river for a while, they couldn't find Li's body, and with no other way to find her, her father paid for a few small boats to travel further down the river. Folklore held that the drowned person would float on his own. If not because the majority of them are entangled in the water ferns, people were still looking for Li's body down the water. Her mother was sitting on the bank beating her chest and crying to death. She said that she regretted and shouldn't have opposed this marriage. She forced her daughter into this path. But there was no medicine to heal regret in this world, and no matter how much she cried, Li could not be revived.
It's my fault. Li, I hurt you.
From 2 o'clock in the afternoon until more than 7 o'clock in the evening, the body of Li wasn't found. Her family had paid to search for 3 days, but the body could not be found, which devastated Li's father and mother. Her mother couldn't handle the shock of her daughter's death and collapsed in bed, while her father scowled. That night, their family gathered to talk about how to resolve it. It was fine if nobody talked about her loss, but whenever Li was mentioned, the old woman's tears welled up in her eyes, beating her chest with regret. Her father was smoking a lot with a sad face all the time. The daughter was born from their guts, but now she was lying cold in the deep water, breaking their hearts. Li's brother stated that there was something wrong with the situation and suggested looking for a shaman to see if it could be resolved. The couple agreed with the idea. There was no other option. They could only try. 2 men arrived in Xiaoping village and looked for Mr. Shen's house. When a woman opened the door, Li's father said, "We came to meet Mr. Shen." The woman said nothing and turned around to let them into the yard. She brought the 2 of them into the room, opened the door, and informed people in the room that someone had come for business. At this point, they looked at the old blind man sitting in the room with a white beard. He greeted them. Li's father placed the items he had brought on the table. Li's father sat down, eager to find a body, but because he couldn't, he told Shen what had happened. When the old man Shen heard this, he sighed and said that Li was very resentful. When Li's father heard what Mr. Shen said, it was clear that Mr. Shen would have known something. He begged Mr. Shen to show him the way, and Mr. Shen replied that Li wanted to get married. Li's father was surprised to hear about the marriage and the afterlife. Shen gave the father detailed instructions on how to organize a wedding for the dead so that her body could be found. Finally, Mr. Shen emphasized that the ideal yin marriage partner would be someone who wished to die in love with his daughter. Li's father was concerned after leaving his house. The relationship between the 2 families was strained in the past, but now he had to find someone who was compatible with this yin and yang marriage. Although his heart was troubled, Li's father had to grit his teeth and endure knocking on Zhao's door in order for his daughter to rest in peace as soon as possible. When Zhao's father opened the door and saw Li's father and brother, he was taken aback because 2 families had long since lost contact. Li's father was not pleased when he saw Zhao's face. His daughter was no longer with him, but their son was fine. First, Li's father claimed that his family was to blame and that he should not have stopped the children from falling in love. But when Zhao's father learned that he wanted his son to marry the dead girl, he became enraged. With that, Zhao's father violently shut the door, not allowing Li's father to speak another word. Despite being mentally prepared when he arrived, Li's father was still upset by Zhao's father's attitude. At this point, his son persuaded him to go back to find another solution. He sighed and turned home with his son. At this point, they heard the door to Zhao's house open. Zhao was the one who opened the door, screamed with emotion, and declared his intention to marry Li. Because Zhao's parents were powerless to stop their son, the two families arranged a yin-yang marriage, a belated wedding, yin and yang separation. That night, both sides of the family prepared all of the offering and the heartbreaking black and white Li's portrait. Zhao was also well dressed. The two had often fantasized about getting married, but no one imagined that they would have to marry under such ironic circumstances. Li's father purchased a rooster in accordance with Mr. Shen's instructions. Zhao hugged the chicken to his lap and bowed his head in front of Li's portrait. The long-awaited marriage of two young people had finally begun. According to the blind old man Shen, Zhao bit his right hand and dripped blood on the rooster's head. Mr. Shen said that the rooster would replace Zhao to go to find Li. Li's parents then placed the rooster in a cage and transported it to the river where Li committed suicide. Li's mother hugged the cage, choking with tears. If they hadn't stopped the children, they wouldn't have done these stupid things. Li's mother threw the cage into the river, extremely regretful. After a while, the water began to bubble up, as if something was about to rise. Then, Li's body came to the surface. Li's face was still fresh after days of being submerged in water, and the long-awaited wedding finally took place. Li was Zhao's wife after this marriage. Zhao insisted on burying Li in his family's ancestral grave, despite his parents' objections. Zhao would never give up on this love, and he wouldn't marry until getting old. He told his family that he only had one wife in this life, Li, and that if he died, they should bury him with Li. It occurred in Tai Po Town, Hong Kong in 2013. I wouldn't say exactly which hospital and which district it was in, because I was still working there. It was my second year working in this hospital, and I had grown accustomed to the job, so my working attitude became sluggish. I was hiding in the corner of the stairs one afternoon to smoke a cigarette when I heard a nurse call my name. "Dr. Jen? I have a patient who requires surgery." It turned out that a patient had just been taken to the emergency room with an injury that required immediate surgery. At the time, I wasn't the primary surgeon, but I was also a doctor. I didn't dare to ignore it at that time, so I immediately threw the cigarette butt away and dashed into the operating room with the nurse. I was a step behind schedule, and the patient was ushered into the emergency operating room. The treating doctor didn't even reprimand me. He simply told me to disinfect and get to work. I packed my belongings and rushed to the surgery room, and it was only then that I noticed the patient's wound. The patient had a severe wound, with the lower half of the arm completely gone. Despite my limited experience, I could see that the wound wasn't cut, that the arm had been completely ripped off by some force. This type of injury was uncommon, and it was also the most difficult type of hand surgery in which I had been directly involved. The surgery took more than 5 hours to complete, and we did our best to treat all of the nerves and blood vessels in the patient's wounded arm. When I arrived at work the next day, the patient had awakened, and I had learned about his condition during the sessions. "How did you get injured like this?" I inquired. To be honest, I didn't care how his injury occurred. When he came to recall the reason, he had a terrifying expression on his face, as if he was hesitant to tell. His family lived in a rural suburb, a small fishing village by the sea, he said. While many people in the village relied on fishing for a living, his family was an exception. They relied on farming to support their family. Because there was a lot of arable land in the village, he told everyone in his family to clean up to start planting, and his family agreed. So, during this time he plowed the land, digging for many years without planting anything, and he was extremely tired, but he felt happy. He was digging in the ground the other day when he came to a halt with a stunned expression. He turned over his pickaxe and saw that it was a human skull, and half of it was rotting. Although this was not a good omen, he didn't take it too seriously because his ancestors had lived here for many generations, so the ground had buried a few dead people. Furthermore, those bones had been here for more than a dozen years. The ghost had long since reincarnated, and he threw all the bones he dug out on the grass at the field's edge. After a while, many more bone fragments were dug out one by one, but they were all broken up. When he finished digging, there was already a pile of bones lying there, and it appeared to be quite complete. He didn't think it was good to be seen by others, so he returned home after burying the bones. He lived in the westernmost part of the village, away from other people's homes. All of the family's children worked in the city, and he was the only one who lived here alone. He was tired all day, so he went to bed early and fell asleep without noticing. He was awakened unexpectedly in the middle of the night by a knock on the door. The sound was becoming increasingly louder as if someone outside was knocking on the door. Whoever came to the door at this hour astounded him. Just as he was about to get up, the door of the room was violently opened. At the door, a shadow appeared. He inquired several times, but the shadow did not respond, and instead entered the room very naturally, as if it were a place devoid of people. As it got closer, he realized it was an old man dressed in antique clothing who looked very scary. But the old man only had one arm and shouted at him as he approached. The old man asked him to give back his arm because he had lost one, but this was a ridiculous request. The old man reacted hastily. Maybe today the skeleton he discovered in the ground had come to haunt him. Perhaps he lost a portion of the old man's arm while digging up bones. However, his bones were also discovered in a state of disarray. The old man walked over to the bed and grabbed his arm before he could react. He was not sure how skinny old man could be so strong. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his arm, and the elderly man with extraordinary strength yanked his arm away. The old man ripped his arm off and caused him great pain. The intense pain and fear caused his mind to go blank, and he couldn't feel anything. Then he passed out. When neighbors heard the screams, they discovered that he was injured badly and took him to the hospital. He had no idea where the ghost had taken his arm. The neighbors searched for a long time but were unable to locate it. After hearing what he said, I was speechless. I thought he was maybe suffering from a mental illness, so I summoned his son and told him to look after his father, fearing that his self-harming behavior would interfere with the treatment. But I could tell his son was uninterested in what I had to say because he believed his father's story was true. I didn't think it was necessary to say anything else, so I went back to my business that day, thinking I'd find out later. Then his son came to tell me that he had returned to the village to check on his father's request. Sure enough, his son discovered the small mound that his father had built. Then he dug it up to double check and was very careful in doing so. His son saw the scattered bones as his father described them, and he did not lie. The son simply put the bones together out of curiosity, and it turned out that a piece of arm bone was indeed missing. What was more terrifying was that his son discovered in that grave the piece of his father's arm that had been rotting with maggots. Only then did his son fully believe his father wasn't lying, and that the unjust spirit had ripped off his father's hand. That year, the drought was severe, so the place where I lived had lost the crop. Our family has moved to another place to live, hoping for it to be better. This is an old house, consisting of many rooms, old built-in architecture. It looks slightly dusty and messy, but better than nothing. My father said to clean. The whole family can live here too, because this is the house of a deceased friend left for his father. So the whole family cleaned up. More than half finished, the house was also a lot tidier. That night, the three of us slept together. My older sister was about 15 years old at that time, and I was my second sister. At that time, I was only 10 years old. Behind me was Chi, 6 years old. But for some reason, I was struggling and unable to sleep. I felt a sense of insecurity from the next room. The room is ancient. My family is not using it, so I haven't cleaned it up yet. That word kept emitting a creepy feeling. Losing sleep for a long time, I also gradually fell asleep. But not yet profound, I heard chuckles emanating from that room. Laughter growing louder. The door slowly opened. I began to panic, but still tried to stay silent in bed. And then, out of the room suddenly came out two girls, white faces, white eyes, and a strange smile. What scared me the most was that their feet weren't touching the ground. They were floating with red shoes. I panicked, but still tried to close my eyes and pretend I was sleeping as they slowly approached my mirror. I felt cold, and their gaze were on my three sisters. I don't know what they're going to do to us. I just laid there without moving. They kept whispering and smiling horribly. It seemed like they were choosing something. I was too young to notice the problem. In the end, it seemed like they chose me. I could feel a terrible cold hand touching my body. I tried to open my eyes slowly to look at the two sleeping next to me, hoping they would wake up to save me. But they were almost in a deep sleep, not knowing what I was facing. I glanced at them, but what I saw was genuinely awful. They're just two dry bones with old clothes. They were standing right behind me and seemingly tried to pull me somewhere. I was so scared. I hurriedly pulled the covers over my body and then fell asleep without realizing it. In the morning, everything was still as usual, but I still do not dare to open the blanket. After a while, little Lily woke me up when she saw that I wouldn't wake up. I quickly woke up, got out of my bed and blanket, and shouted about the two women who came out from that room last night. But my older sister may not believe what I said. She thought it was because I had a nightmare. No matter how I clung and cried, my sisters still doubted and didn't believe what I said. I recounted everything I experienced last night to her and hoped Nissan will come and take a look inside that room with a frightened expression. After hearing my mourning, Nissan reluctantly walked over to the room to examine the interior to reassure me that there was nothing inside. And indeed, Nissan opened the door of the room so I could come and see inside. Even though I was still terrified, I still walked over to her, hands clasping on Nissan and looking around inside the room. This is an old room, messy and thick. As my older sister said, there's no one inside. Maybe I'm dreaming. Because he waited for us for so long, my dad came in and saw three sisters standing in front of the other room door, so he urged us to come out for breakfast and asked what was going on. The oldest sister told him what I told her, and also told my dad that we went to see the room, but it's completely normal with no one inside. After hearing that, my father scolded us because just because of a stupid dream and not going to breakfast, my parents had to go to the fields to work. After breakfast, my second sister and my parents went to the field to harvest potatoes. Baby Lily is young, so she cannot accompany us. But since this is a peaceful countryside, we were not afraid for Lily. After a while, rain started pouring down. We also drove the baskets of potatoes home. The cart got a lot heavier because this year the potatoes had a good harvest. We help each other carry each basket of potatoes into the house. This year we'll make a lot of money. I also gradually forgot about yesterday's horror. The rain was getting heavier and heavier, so we quickly loaded the potatoes inside. Otherwise, they would be waterlogged. As soon as we opened the door and looked into the house, we saw little Lily playing in the yard, seemingly very happy. My mother was worried because of the heavy rain that little Lily could still play in front of the yard, but refused to go to the house to shelter from the rain. My mother was afraid she would fall sick. But little Lily seemed highly excited and told her mother that she was enjoying herself with her beautiful sisters. In response to my mother's question, I gradually realized what was unusual, and it seemed what little Lily said was true. There were lots of shoe marks on the ground. She was playing with someone in the yard of the house. That night, out of panic about the night before, I asked to let me sleep with my parents. Even though nothing strange had happened all night, I was apprehensive about some nervous feeling that I could not sleep. The following day, as well as every day, the whole family sat together for breakfast. But Lily didn't eat anything, even when my parents told her to. My parents asked that little Lily said that she would be taken away to eat well by some beautiful sisters. The carefree words of a child did not make my parents too concerned. That day, we also needed to go to the fields. As usual, my mother was afraid that a stranger would come to seduce Lily, so she told her not to open the door for anyone to come in. At that time, I was a child, so I didn't know what happened. I just felt a little insecure. So I asked my mother to bring Lily along with me that day. But my father seemed annoyed by it because little Lily often ran and jumped. It would take time to watch. The whole family would not be able to concentrate on farming. Everyone in the family was afraid of my father, so according to my father's instructions, it would not be a problem to lock the door carefully. My mother also thought so, so she obeyed my father. I'm alone in discomfort, but I'm too young to give my opinion. Before the door closed, I still remember clearly now, her white face, dark eyes and strange smile of Lily. She looked at me like a farewell. After that, we got into the familiar cart and left the house. After the field work, we could not see Lily playing in the yard anymore. When we came back home, it was strange that my mother called Lily repeatedly. After entering the house to search, my mother frantically ran out to inform everyone. The whole family was shocked. We split up to look for Lily. The older sister and I were worried about her. We ran around the village to see if anyone knew anything. My father entered the other strange room to search for her, and I was hoping that Lily was just playing hide and seek. But to our dread, little Lily was truly missing. After that, we stayed for a bit longer, then eventually decided to leave the heartbreaking place and move to a neighboring village. Years later, when I was much older, I heard that people came to clean and break the house down for farmland. Suddenly, while breaking down the fence, they accidentally bumped into something that seemed hard below the ground, so they decided to dig down to take a look below. After a while of digging, they discovered a big wooden coffin, which surprised everyone because ordinary coffins could not be that big. They opened the lid of the coffin to examine the interior and took the remains of the deceased so they could be buried somewhere else. All this so that the dead would have a proper place to rest. The coffin was indeed huge, holding at least 3 to 4 people. They also worked very hard to be able to open the lid to close the inside. But what was inside surprised them, and the story spread everywhere, which led my family to learn the reason why little Lily disappeared so mysteriously. Inside the coffin were the corpses of 2 women and a child. They were placed very neatly inside of it. And just like the workers described, there was a little baby girl who fitted the exact same description as Lily. The two women had turned to white bones, but the child looked like she had died recently. At that time, as I was older, I could speak my mind and realized Lily should have never been the one to get caught, because the one who should have gotten caught should have been me. This is a story that happened a long time ago in my village, when I was a high school student about to take my final exam. I used to stay up until early morning to review my lessons because that was when the area where I lived was the quietest. I resolved to complete all of my homework before going to bed, but it always seemed to pile up like a mountain. When I realized I didn't have the energy to keep going, I sat back in my chair and rested for a few minutes. Many days had passed and I'd always studied until I was exhausted and my eyes couldn't open any longer. So I sat down at the table, intending to sleep for nearly 30 minutes in order to regain my energy. I was sleeping when I heard some loud noises outside that sounded like a trumpet and bride procession music. The music became increasingly louder as the group approached nearer to my house, making it impossible for me to sleep any longer. I started to feel uncomfortable and secretly blamed that family for having such a late-night wedding. At first, I considered returning to my desk and ignoring outside distractions in order to focus on my homework. But no matter how hard I tried, I was distracted by outside noises. Outside, the singing was like a magical power entering my mind, making it impossible for me to concentrate on my own affairs. This time, I resolved to focus with all my might, staring at the page in front of me, my mind ignoring the trumpets playing outside. But in the end, I couldn't take it any longer, so I slammed my fist on the table and sat up in rage. I drank a small sip of water to relax and then went to the windows, intending to wait for the bride to come to complain. I slowly opened the windows and began to look outside to see how far this procession had progressed. In the dark night, a large group of people and the shadow of a palanquin appeared from afar in the dense fog. I couldn't see the faces of anyone in the group because it was too dark and there was an overcast fog. But what drew my attention to this group of people was their unusual appearance. They walked and danced in strange movements. The scene in front of me began to make me wonder, fearful and curious. I had no idea if they were any of people in my village. After a while, the group stopped singing and simply blew the trumpet loudly. I began to feel helpless because I considered it as a joyful activity for other people's families. So I didn't want to interfere and instead sat in the house with curious eyes. After a while, the procession arrived at my house as well. I began to rise, intending to share my blessings on this group of people. But when the group began to appear clearly under the dim street lights, I was astounded to see each person's face. They were not normal humans. Their faces were also blurred, and they resembled demons from hell. Their skins were pale, their cheeks rosy, and their lips always smiled. Even worse, the flesh had all vanished, leaving only a few wrinkled pieces clinging to the concave bones. They were carrying the palanquin while grinning manically. The wind came out of nowhere and yanked open the palanquin's curtain, revealing the empty space inside. I panicked. I wanted to scream but couldn't. All I could do was stand still and watch the group in front of me. I knew they weren't normal people like me, so when they were just passing by, I turned inside the house, clutching my mouth and trembling. The trumpet was right next to my ear. I could clearly feel the bright blue eyes outside staring at me from inside the room. When I tried to look outside, not only did the man carrying the palanquin, but also the girl walking in the middle of the group was also staring at me with a ghostly expression. I shivered, every now and then not sure if it was from the cold running down my spine as the group passed by or because I was too scared. I took a deep breath and tried to look out the windows, just as the eyes on the other side met mine. I was startled and quickly hid behind the wall, dozens of confusing questions ringing in my head before going blank. I sat down on the ground, hugging my knees and shivering, feeling that the songs outside were the magic that was trying to fascinate me. I grimaced, gritted my teeth, and waited for the group to leave before standing up to assess the situation outside. In the hazy smoke, the procession of the palanquin had traveled a long distance by the end of the village. I had never taken my gaze away from them. I could clearly see the procession of people bringing that red palanquin to a dilapidated house that had long been abandoned. Despite the fact that the procession group had traveled a long distance, I could still hear the sound of the drums and trumpets. The group abruptly came to a halt in front of that abandoned house. The trumpet sound was also deafeningly quiet. The group stood motionless, surrounded by a gloomy atmosphere. After a few seconds, the group brought the palanquin inside and quietly left. When I looked at the house within the black scorch marks, I was taken aback by recalling the heartbreaking story that had occurred here. Not so long ago, this wooden house was the most well-known and spacious restaurant in my village. No one was unaware of it. On this day a few years ago, a big wedding was held at this restaurant. The atmosphere was very lively here. Guests had been eating and drinking in the restaurant for quite a long time. Everyone was anticipating the arrival of the bride for the ceremony. Both sides of the family were extremely busy. Congratulations could be heard throughout the restaurant, and the atmosphere was extremely lively at this time. By the middle of the party, the restaurant downstairs was filling up with black smoke. A man became frightened and ran upstairs. When he arrived, he quickly shouted, informing those present of the fire that was raging downstairs. After hearing that, the people at the party that day began to let go of their chopsticks, their mouths gaping at the panicking man in front of them. The black smoke from downstairs spread to the party's area as soon as the sentence ended, and the guests began to stir. Those present could see the deadly fire rising from the restaurant's window as if it wanted to burn down the entire establishment. Everyone began to stand up one by one, frantically looking for a way out. Loud screams rang throughout the restaurant, but no one could help them. The villagers who had also heard about the fire curiously ran over, standing below helplessly looking inside. Before the fire truck arrived, some people began using the most basic fire suppression methods in the hope of reducing the severity of the incident. However, the fire in the night transformed into a demon, quickly devouring both the restaurant and the people who were present. The fire burned into their bodies, consuming all those fleeting in the blink of an eye, and no one had a chance to escape. In the ocean of flame, the black shadows appearing by the upstairs windows begging for help, and then fell down. That image haunted the people of my village. The signboard for the restaurant was also set ablaze. The fire had been extinguished by dawn, but the memories associated with this restaurant had also been reduced to ashes. Fire trucks were parking along the road to the village that night, and no one dared to go out because they were so terrified. The village changed over time, becoming a busy street, but the restaurant remained as how it was after that night. I shivered in bed all night, unable to sleep, because the burned spirits in the fire that night kept haunting me. Every time I took a nap, Those ghostly horror faces appeared in my dreams, worsening my health. Outside the windows, in particular, I always had the distinct impression that the group was still standing there, peering inside and calling my name. Every night after the entire village had fallen asleep, the sound of the trumpet and the image of the wedding procession to the burned out restaurant appeared. Many people claimed to have seen the bride in the palanquin. She kept singing the wedding carol in the sorrow and pain. Many people said the bride was stunning, with a veil covering her face but allowing them to see her bright white eyes. The smoke from the restaurant suddenly spread every time the procession brought the palanquin into the restaurant, just like the fire scene that year. People in the village spread rumors about the procession group who died in the village. Since then, the restaurant has been deserted, and no one dared to approach and considered the ghost carrying the procession as an anecdote.
That story happened in my senior year. My girlfriend and I both spent time studying in the library every day. One day she offered to take a day off to prepare my birthday gifts with her. Hearing that, I teased her that just wrapping her in my gift box would be fine. So she pinched my ears and said that I had some shady intentions in mind, right? I looked at her and said that she and I had known each other for a long time and should also consider getting married. I told my girlfriend that I didn't care much about my birthday because I looked quite old compared to the other students. By the way, I told her the story that made me miss school for 2 years and had a bad impression of my birthday. On my 12th birthday, my mother asked me to wear a red triangular paper bag. She said that the year was my year and told me to wear it every day, shouldn't tear it or lose it. Although I didn't like it very much, I still obeyed my mother's orders to wear a string with a red paper bag around the neck. Then I rushed to play with my friends. My friends and I gathered to play marbles together. When it was my turn, something embarrassing happened. When I crouched down, my red underwear was revealed. One of the guys in the group noticed and pulled my pants off. The group kept laughing at me, saying that I had a problem with my gender and thought I was an idiot. I held at him that I wasn't an idiot and told them I wore red underwear because this year was my year and my mother made me wear it. At this time, another guy living next door to my house confirmed that my mother had given me a red amulet and the underwear was related to that amulet. So he teased me and begged me to show the amulet on my neck. A few other friends also came and said they wanted to see my amulet. So I took off the amulet chain around my neck. My friends had never seen such amulets, so they all found it very strange. By the way, I was also joking that this amulet could help see ghosts.
Wow.
But unexpectedly, they believed my lie to be true. They came closer and took a closer look. I was afraid that if my friend held it too hard, it would tear my amulet, so I quickly got it back. But he lunged forward to snatch the amulet from my hand. I showed an unpleasant attitude, saying that this was not for fun. If the amulet was broken, I would be scolded by my mother. But that boy wanted to get my amulet, so he asked me to play marbles. He bet on 3 of the latest comic books in exchange for my amulet. After hearing that, we were all surprised. I had long wanted to read the 3 comic books he talked about, but he wouldn't lend it to us. With the instigation of other friends, I began to think. Yes, wasn't this amulet just a red paper bag? Therefore, he and I would decide whether to win or lose in the game of marbles.
But unfortunately, I lost the necklace to my friend because, well, I lost. Looking at his proud appearance, I felt very uncomfortable. Without the amulet, I was just afraid of being scolded when I got home. After the amulet was taken by my friend, I had to walk home. When I got home, I kept quiet for fear that my family would find out that I had lost the amulet. Luckily, they didn't notice. For the next few days, my life went on as normal. Until the following weekend, we arranged to bake sweet potatoes on the hill where we used to go. When everyone was busy building a fire, my friend discovered something. He said he saw a coffin. He ran over and took a closer look. It was a broken coffin. It seemed to have been trapped by a landslide caused by heavy rain 2 days ago. Although curious, the stench emanating from the crack in the coffin lid made us nauseous. We were starting to get a little scared, but my friend didn't want to leave. He stood still, his eyes fixed on the crack in the coffin. Suddenly he turned his head and said with a worried look that he wanted to see what was inside the coffin. I advised him not to be so stupid, but he ignored me and still insisted on pulling it out, so I left, ignoring him. Seeing me ignore him, he aimed at my shame point with his red underwear. He said that I was only a coward. He also said that my amulet was fake, that I was just a liar, and that even our family lied. Frustrated, I turned around and told him that I wasn't afraid of what was inside the coffin and would open it with him to see what was inside. The two of us struggled for a long time and couldn't move the coffin because most of the coffin was still in the ground, and there was also a lot of dirt on top of it. The two of us continued to pull the coffin lid. Suddenly, the piece of wood he was pulling came loose. Before he could prepare, he lost his balance and fell backward. Fortunately, there were no serious problems. The coffin board was casually thrown aside by him. Looking at the pointed end of the board gave me chills. In the coffin, there was an opening big enough for us to get in. I could even try to glimpse the corpse inside. My friend remained unafraid and said he wanted to go inside to find out. In the blink of an eye, he jumped inside and urged me to follow. It was very dark inside, and the smell was disgusting. This coffin was just enough for the two of them to get in, but there was no room to turn around. I felt a dead body in front of me, so I was extremely worried. After struggling for a while, we finally hit a spark. My friend was not afraid at all. Although the light of the match was limited, we could still see the contents of the coffin. We were suddenly stunned by the sight before us, which was a shriveled woman's body. Because he was so scared, the match in his hand fell. Even more frightening, we saw between the legs of that woman still a dead baby. It was only partially protruding from the woman. Terrified, we all felt short of breath and quickly climbed out of the coffin. Seeing the two of us crying while running, the other two friends thought we saw zombies. They quickly asked us what happened. The friend described the situation in the coffin to them while I was breathing heavily next to it. It was probably the fastest run of my life. The potatoes were cooked. They invited us to eat baked sweet potatoes while comforting us. We looked at the two sweet potatoes that had been baked to the point of shriveling like the corpse we just saw now, so we both ran away and vomited. That night, because I was still haunted by the story in the afternoon, I couldn't eat dinner. Then I went to my room to go to bed early. At midnight, I had a high fever again. I was tired and I was dreaming. Suddenly, I found myself not in bed, but locked in a wooden box. It felt like being in a coffin. Someone next to me shouted, making me dumbfounded. I saw a woman with a pregnant woman lying next to me, screaming while banging on the board above. Suddenly, my view turned to the outside and I saw a large group of villagers gathered. I seemed to understand the problem. This woman was being buried alive by the men in the village. When the last piece of land was filled in, the woman's screams could barely be heard outside. More frightening at this time, the woman seemed to be about to give birth, holding her belly and crying in pain. But the oxygen in the coffin was getting weaker and weaker. At this point, the woman seemed to have exhausted all her strength. The scene was so real that I was so scared. I could only cover my eyes with my hands. In my dream, I vaguely heard my mother calling my name. At this time, I had a very high fever and my whole body was hot. My grandmother and mother were very worried. Grandma seemed to have discovered something. She sadly looked at my condition. In the blink of an eye, she discovered that the amulet on my neck was missing. My grandmother quickly went out in a hurry. Moments later, my grandmother came home with a red amulet in her hand. It turned out that she went to my friend's house to get it back. Although annoyed, I still tried to ask my grandmother about the amulet. She said this amulet was very important to me. It helped me to exercise and not be invaded by evil spirits. Then I put on the amulet and fell into a deep sleep. After taking the cold medicine, I immediately fell asleep. The following morning, my condition was basically recovered. Because I didn't eat yesterday, now I ate like a hungry ghost. At this time, the friend we had baked sweet potatoes with the day before came running over and said that the friend who robbed my amulet was dead. I was stunned as soon as I heard that. I broke out in a cold sweat. I wondered if the female zombie in my dream killed him. My friend said he fell from a tree and died. Now the whole village was gathering to see the situation. More frightening, this was where we saw the coffin earlier. As we passed through the crowd, we saw his parents crying over his body. We were also shocked because his death was so tragic. He died because the wooden coffin lid was broken and thrown aside by him. Unexpectedly, his sharp piece was located under the tree where he took the bird's egg. The elders of the village proceeded to bury his body. My grandmother said that the amulet was my own. Even if he wore it, it wouldn't work. After hearing my story, my girlfriend was amazed. She thought it was a story I made up to comfort her. It sounded like a myth, but in reality, I was only saying what I had witnessed with my own eyes.
When it came to the profession of carrying coffins, there were many taboos as well as scary stories happening around it. For example, a person doing this job was absolutely not allowed to have sex the night before, not to get married or have children, to avoid injury and not to let blood get on the coffin. And most important taboo was that from the moment the coffin was lifted until the grave was reached, the coffin must not touch the ground. And the person carrying the coffin must not complain or say negative words, no matter how tired they were. Speaking of which, I want to tell you about a true story that happened in my village. That year, a 70-year-old woman died of illness in my village. Her family also held a funeral for her. At the time, the management of funerals was very strict due to concerns about epidemics. The older woman family hired workers from a nearby mine for the burial. And these people knew absolutely nothing about the burial customs in our village. Taking advantage of the early morning hours, they proceeded to carry the coffin, not knowing that something terrible was waiting for them ahead. They did not have much experience in burial, but it must be said that they were in good health. Carrying the coffin was not a problem for them, because to ensure safety, not to violate the government's ban, the funeral took place without drums, and everyone went quietly to the back of the mountain. In the past, our villagers used to bury their relatives in a cemetery in the forest. It was about 2 kilometers from the village. The path was not difficult at all. However, while carrying the coffin near the cemetery, the coffin carriers suddenly felt that something was wrong. The coffin suddenly became very heavy, and the road became steeper, making the steps quite heavy too. Everyone felt that the road that day seemed a bit strange. "Oh my God! Why is it so heavy?" said one of the group members carrying the coffin. His elbows were shaking from the coffin's weight. Before they could continue, everyone felt that the coffin was a bit heavier than usual. The weight made the group stop because they couldn't stand it anymore. At this point, one of the group thought that maybe due to going uphill, the coffin would be heavier. The man did his best to exhort the people in the group to keep going. It was also close to the cemetery at that time. Everyone in the group tried to carry the coffin with all their might, even though it was growing strangely heavier. And at that very moment, something monstrous happened. The coffin suddenly shook violently. Then there were loud noises on the coffin lid. It seemed that someone inside was trying to break through to get out. The old woman had been dead for a few days. Was it possible that the old woman had come back to life? Family members of the old woman were also surprised. The coffin shook more and more violently each day, accompanied by high-pitched explosions coming from the coffin. The coffin carriers were trying their best at this point, but the weight of the coffin held them tightly. Suddenly an explosion rang out in the sky, accompanied by the boos of many people around. The coffin fell to the ground because of the steep slope. The people carrying the coffin fell backwards. Both the body and the coffin slid down the slope. The coffin slid down the slope for a while and then stopped. Everyone rushed over to hold the coffin upright. At that time, the family members of the old woman also expressed panic. They looked at each other without knowing what to do next. Scary things kept happening. Inside the coffin, the sound of smashing continued to be deafening. The noise grew louder in this quiet forest. The noises were getting louder by the moment as the old woman inside was seemingly about to rush out. The onlookers felt extremely frightened. Everyone panicked. It was the first time people had encountered such a situation. Someone was going to take a rope to open the coffin and take a look inside. Just then, an old man approached and said that they had broken some taboos against the dead. "Come on, one of you got hurt, right?" The old man was an experienced person in this matter because he had seen such a situation in his youth. So he asked. Sure enough, someone was injured during the mining process among the workers carrying the coffin. So the old man quickly lit incense and prayed for the soul of the old woman to forgive their mistakes. The old man said that the wounds on the workers' hands had accidentally caused blood to stick to the coffin walls. This thing was a taboo. Everyone must kneel and ask for forgiveness. The old woman's family and the workers carrying the coffin nervously watched the old man's actions. Incense was lit, and the old man also performed the ritual to apologize to the deceased. Just burning paper, the old man prayed for the old woman to pass away peacefully. Everyone knelt around to bow to the coffin. At this point, the wind was strong, and the inside of the coffin kept making shrill noises. However, the coffin had not stopped. The old man suspected that there was still guilt on the part of the family. He asked the old woman's relatives to sincerely admit their mistakes, and after a while the coffin stopped shaking. Everyone gradually returned to its original calm state. Suddenly, the old woman's son explained that it was indeed the fault of him and his wife. because last night they slept together. The old man explained that thing was a taboo to do, to have sex in the family that night. Luckily, the apology was accepted by the dead. People continued to carry the coffin up towards the burial. From that moment on, nothing happened. The coffin was taken to the cemetery and properly buried. Later, I learned more taboos about coffin carrying. There were scary things that could cost people their lives. Later, when I have a chance, I will tell you all about it.
My cousin and I were frequently visiting our grandparents during our summer vacations when we were children. That year was the same. I was around 12 years old and my cousin Shui was the same age. Shui and I were both really interested in pottery after seeing a program on TV. So when the program ended, he and I walked to the back of the hill to collect clay, then formed it. My cousin was a moron. He had worked all day and could only make a small bowl, but he was already satisfied. As for me, I could make a little human statue, which I was extremely proud of, and it appeared that I also had a knack for molding the statue. After that, Shui enticed me to build a kiln so that they would become pottery, just like on TV, so we started collecting bricks, stones, and soil. We found a lot of stones in the forest and were quickly able to construct a sturdy kiln. Finally, we split up and grabbed a large amount of firewood, which we placed inside with the bowl and the mannequin we created, fired and burned them. We were overjoyed to see the fire roaring, since it meant that we would soon be able to create ceramics as seen on TV. But as we were waiting for the fire to burn, I heard my mother's voice from the village calling out, "It's time to come home and eat." So I told Shui that we'd go back to eat together, but my grandma warned me not to play with fire in the forest, since it was extremely easy to start a forest fire. We decided to stop the fire for the time being. We stopped the fire, meaning to return the next day to do it again. We left the clay statue and bowl there. Unfortunately, after eating, my cousin was transported to the city by his parents due to business issues, so he had to follow them. Hearing that, I decided to go there and carry out our clay products to the grandma's house for preservation, and then proceed to fire them when Shui returned. But when I got closer to the location, I was taken aback, since from a distance it appeared that someone was standing there. Looking closer, there was a person standing next to our kiln. Did someone discover the items we made? Because I was young and simple, I immediately assumed that someone was going to steal them. So I went over and held at the person to stop. It appeared to be a man. But when I went to the location, he had mysteriously vanished. There was no trace of anyone, most likely because I confused what was a man for something else. I didn't pay much attention either. Instead, I looked inside the kiln to see whether our clay items had been taken. Fortunately, they were still inside. So I reached inside, grabbed them, and began racing back to the village before it became dark, because it would be dangerous in the forest. Suddenly I heard footfall behind me. It got closer to me every time I ran, and when I stopped it slowed down as if it was following me. I stopped and listened, and everything fell silent except for the wind roaring through the rustling trees. It was now dark at this time, and in the forest was pitch dark. The wind had ceased, and the woodland had become eerily calm. Seeing this, I held the statues closely to my lap and continued walking, but my eyes continued looking behind me to see if I could figure out who was following me.
I thought it was the man from before. And indeed, as soon as I looked behind, he was standing there, gazing at me. It was so creepy that I fled as fast as I could to the village without daring to look back. When I approached the village and saw two old men sitting and talking, I was relieved to take a breath. I was expecting the appearance of someone else who would make the other man abandon his desire to pursue me. But the shiver raced down my spine and I had the feeling that someone was still watching me from behind, so I turned my head to look. A figure in the distance was still following me. I was certain it was the same man. Even though it was a long distance away, I still could see his face staring at me with angry eyes. For a youngster like me, this was too frightening. I didn't dare to stare any longer, but instead turned around and rushed home. I didn't dare to inform my parents that night for fear of getting scolded for starting a fire in the forest. I went to bed early and eventually forgot about the strange man. I was sleeping at midnight when I was jolted awake by weird noises and the room became colder. My parents were sleeping next to me when I gently opened my eyes. The sound of the door opening drew my attention and I turned to see when a figure slowly entered my room. He was moaning while walking in, his movements odd, twisted and like gliding across the ground, his body blue-gray and cracked like dry soil. He went closer and closer to me. The closer he got, the colder my body felt and trembled. My body remained stiff at this point, and I looked over at my parents, who were still sleeping, but I had no way to wake them up. Only my eyes could move. The rest of my body was numb. Later on, when I was older, I realized it was sleep paralysis. The man stood next to my bed, his face deformed abruptly. His eyes were blood red. His mouth was wide open. His eyes were bulging with crimson veins, and his skin was cracked, which was too frightening. He stretched out his hand as if about to strangle me, and his mouth moaned and asked me to return something to him. When I was the most terrified, I heard my father's voice in my ear. He held my name loudly and shook my body. I felt it, but it was difficult to wake up. My eyes were still closed, but I heard my father calling, and he got up and grabbed for the light switch. When the light was turned on, I knew it was time that I could get rid of the man, so I opened my eyes to see the light in front of me. Mom and Dad were standing next to me, and they assumed I was having a horrible dream. They looked worried and asked me what I had dreamt of that caused me to weep in my sleep like that. When I saw my family at this point, all I could do was burst out in tears and told them about what Shui and I did at lunchtime, and then about the weird man. My parents were horrified when I finished. They immediately rushed to summon a famous shaman in the village. Miss Yang was old, but she was extremely skilled at these things. When she entered the house, she asked me about everything that had transpired and then looked around. She abruptly averted her attention from the bowl and clay statue that Shui and I had made in the morning. Miss Yang stated that in that forest there were many unresolved ghosts, and when I built a human figure, they went there to reside, so they didn't want me to take it away. Then my parents and Miss Yang set fire to a large number of joss papers in front of the house, close to that clay statue and bowl, and eventually put it back where it belonged at the edge of the forest in the kiln that Shui and I built. Miss Yang also assured my parents that if they put a butcher knife under my pillow, everything would be back to normal. But the next day, I had high fever that lasted many days, until I healed entirely. Recently, a small supermarket was built in my neighborhood, and it is also the first supermarket built in this area, so people here are very curious and frequently visited it. Inside, it's similar to many other supermarkets. However, after only a few days of operation, the supermarket's customer base gradually decreased from a crowded supermarket to an empty one. Every morning the toys in the children's stall were discovered lying on the ground, strewn about. This infuriated the investor, a wealthy woman. She has repeatedly admonished the staff, but the same thing keeps happening. Her eyes raged at the supermarket manager, blaming him for not managing his employees well and blaming the employees for being lazy and refusing to clean. The manager was also taken aback when he heard this. He tried to explain the toys issued to the investor and explained that he tried himself, but he couldn't fix it. When the investor heard that, she assumed that someone had broken into the supermarket late at night and attempted to ask the manager to find a solution. Initially, the manager was also perplexed and disturbed. He stated that he checked the camera at the supermarket every night but had yet to see anyone, because these toys had been used continuously since the supermarket opened, so his words to the investor were like an excuse to avoid responsibility. There was no other option. The investor threatened to fire the manager if he allowed the situation to continue without investigating the cause. Seeing this, the manager promised the investor that he would instruct security guards at the children's stall every night to investigate who had tampered with the goods in this location. He finally persuaded the investor after a while. So tonight was the first night that security guards would be on duty at the supermarket. The later the atmosphere in this place became cold and gloomy when the entire area inside the supermarket sank into a strange silence. When the supermarket closed, they began to turn off the lights. There wasn't a single person in the supermarket aisle. 2 security guards were stationed here overnight. They had to check around the supermarket and then sleep in the children's stall area according to the manager's orders. They both went to the toy section to look around. Inside, all of the new and used items had been cleaned and neatly arranged on the shelves. One guard prepared a place to sleep, while the other used the time to look around before taking a nap. They would spend the night in the warehouse, which was located opposite the children's stall, to facilitate inspection and to catch red-handed the vandal. After a long period of no unusual movement, one of them became tired and felt sleepy. They both spread blankets and pillows on the floor and placed them next to each other. Their attitudes were unconcerned. Before going to sleep, a middle-aged security guard made a joke that when there were both of them sleeping there tonight, nothing would happen. When the other person heard this, he felt relieved and fell asleep. The current atmosphere in the supermarket fell into silence once again. In the middle of the night, when it looked like nothing would happen, a ghostly phenomenon appeared. The sound of children singing resounded in the supermarket's quiet space. The black shadows clearly imprinted on the curtain in the darkness of the night when the 2 guards were sleeping for a while. They were infants who had just started walking. They walked in a long line, babbling children's rhymes as they made their way to the toy stall. The singing startled the guard, who opened his eyes and looked behind the curtain. When he saw the black figures approaching, he turned to wake up the other guard sleeping next to him, telling him that the bad guys had arrived. The 2 quickly grabbed the flashlight that had been left nearby and went to the children's stall, hoping to arrest the vandals that had been hidden for so long. For fear of making a sound and causing the culprit to flee, the 2 crept up, walked over to the thin curtain nestled behind it and slowly lifted the curtain to observe. Children in soiled clothes appeared in front of them. They were mischievous, competing to remove the toys from the shelf and play together. The children were unaware that two guards were watching them from behind, so they were free to play as usual. Their eyes glowed so strangely and monstrously. A guard noticed the scene and thought it was bizarre, not knowing where these children had come from, so he planned to run over them. But as he took a step forward, the children's faces appeared in the dark with strange horror expressions, as if they were ghosts. The guard covered his mouth because he was shocked, and he didn't know what to do because he knew these kids were not human. However, the guard in the back was terrified and couldn't help but scream out loud. The children's attention were immediately drawn towards the scream. They were startled, stopped their games, and turned to stare at the two guards with blank, lifeless eyes. Both guards were impatient enough to hide and watched them at this point. Their faces turned purple from fear, and they could only scream and tremble. When the children realized they were being watched by humans, their expressions changed immediately, becoming angry and revealing devils' faces. But they also knew there was nothing they could do about it, so they disintegrated into grey smoke and vanished. The toys in their hands also fell to the ground one after the other, resounding with frightening knocks. The two guards realized they had just met baby ghosts, but had no choice but to sit close together, shivering and muttering mantras to protect themselves, wait until dawn, and then move on. The next morning, the two security guards told the strange story they had encountered to the supermarket's manager and investor. It made everyone concerned. The owner of the supermarket seemed to know something ahead of time. She immediately invited a shaman to perform an exorcism and prayed for the dead babies in this location. After that night, the supermarket also blocked the children's stall. A red ribbon was stretched across the front of the stall, and no one was permitted to enter. The investor sighed and recalled when she was asked about what caused the supermarket to be haunted by the dead. She claimed that the supermarket used to be a private maternity hospital of a doctor. Everyone in my neighborhood was familiar with this hospital. This location was well known for abortions. The fetuses would be cremated after abortion in the hospital's secret morgue, which was now a children's stall. No one dared to approach it for a long time because it was full of evil spirits. The employees who worked here later died for various reasons. As a result, the hospital was demolished and sold to the owner of the supermarket. But the dead remained.